The country artist Alan Jackson wrote a song several years ago, or at least released a song several years ago. I believe he was involved in the writing process, even of those lyrics. But he released this song called Drive. Drive. With the parenthesis for Daddy Gene. It is a simple story, but it's a story of generations. It tells the story of a young boy on the lake with Dad, and he gets to take the wheel of the plywood boat. And then he later gets to take the wheel of the old hand-me-down Ford with a dent in the door as they haul trash. And then he looks to the current time, at least as the song's timing goes, of his own daughters driving a Jeep through the valley with a rusty floorboard. And some of us have said Alan Jackson probably didn't have a rusty Jeep in reality with his daughters. But the song isn't about the vehicles or the boat. Not really. And part of that is emphasized by the phrases, it was just an old plywood boat, just an old hand-me-down Ford, just an old Jeep with a rusty floorboard. At least the song shares the power of the special bond that is possible. It isn't always the case, and we recognize that this morning even in this sermon. But the bond that is possible between a dad and his children, signified by that sharing, by those moments and adventures in life, whether you're on the lake or you're hauling trash down a dirt road. And so this morning, I'm not here to berate, to beat up on our dads. And I think this is a good thing, that this has almost become the cliche now among the idea of Sundays and Mother's Day and Father's Day. That it's almost cliche to say Mother's Day is a great day because we celebrate mothers and they're wonderful and they're great, even though that's not always the case. Mother's Day, as we've said, can be horrible. And then Father's Day, you might get a new razor, and then the preacher, it's all about, dads, you better do your job. Do it better. You ain't doing your job. We can say ain't, right? Can't we? And there's a place for all of that for both. There's a place for encouraging moms and dads to, yes, do what is their responsibility. And some of that will find its way today, but I don't think that has to be the way. That's why I called it the joy of fatherhood. That's the word I think of. I tried to find what word not just comes to mind first, but what word, if you had to pick one that really describes what fatherhood can be, what fatherhood is intended to be by God and beyond, joy. We could say the role, we could say the value, we could say challenge. I'd like to think about the joy of being a dad. It's not easy. It has its challenges. You're being a dad to children who become teenagers, who become young adults, hopefully. They get out of some of those stages and eventually become, what word do we have for someone who moves beyond young adult? I guess then you're just an adult, right? And then you move on to other things. But it can be one of the greatest blessings from both sides of this picture. Being a dad. And yet some have accurately, I believe, observed that dads, the role of a father, is the most underappreciated. We paid some tribute to that a moment ago with contrast that often occurs between Mother's Day and Father's Day. And I don't think that's because there are more bad fathers than there are bad mothers. think there's something else at work. For quite some time now, dads have been the laughing stock of media. For sure, within movies and shows, the majority of the time, it isn't always the case, but the majority of the time, the dad is the guy who thinks he knows what's happening in his home and has no idea. The dad who is stupid and is the brunt of all the jokes of the family and the show. And there is this progression of thought within our culture where it is, I don't need a father, I don't need a man. I'm going to, as a woman, I'm going to have my children. And then there's a progression where now it's, well, I can be the dad. Let's make it clear this morning, when we talk about fathers, we're talking about that male leadership role. Not someone who claims to be a male, by the way. Underappreciated? Yeah. But I'm here to tell you this morning, you put all that away, and you mark this down, that God values fathers. God created fatherhood. And as we worship God together today, we appreciate that He chose fathers, that He chose men to be that role in a family. We could summarize it with this statement that God values fathers because God is one. God is a father. And because of their strength, what do we mean by strength? Hold on. So, listen. Listen up. Listen to them. God values fathers. Let's take that statement and take a closer look. God values fathers this morning because God is the Father. God is one. That's not normally the theological context we use that statement. God is one. God is a Father. Both in the way that He is that, He fulfills that, a role like that. What are we taught to pray in Matthew 6:9? Our what? Father who is in heaven. There is a technical sense in which that is God. He is the creator of all, and that way He's the Father of all. As Paul says, He's the Father of everything under heaven. But it's also even more that if you're a Christian today, if you have repented and been baptized into Jesus, you have a special childlike relationship, or at least you can have, with your Creator. But then there are those times throughout the Scriptures where God is compared to a father. And it isn't that God is following the earthly fathers. If anything, He's showing us when earthly fathers are doing their work properly, it's a reflection of who I am. Now, God also compares Himself sometimes to the motherly side. So there's a metaphor part of this. There's His actual fatherhood, and then there are pictures given. Let's look at some of those. In Psalm 103, verses 13 and 14, as we have them sectioned in our Bibles, God compares His compassion to a father's compassion. Psalm 103, verse 13. As the psalmist compiles this list of the characteristics of God, he then adds this: as a father shows compassion to his children. Is that what we think of when we think of a dad? Or do we think of someone who's always rough and gruff? He makes sure the bills get paid. He plays golf on the weekends. He takes naps in his recliner. He watches his shows. I guess sometimes he has to spend some time with mom or we wouldn't be here. But other than that, that's who he is. God says, I've got compassion like a father does. Read the rest of it. He says, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. I don't know, but I tend to think that verse 14 is extra connected to verse 13. Part of what it means to have compassion and gentleness as dad, as the masculine side of this picture of a home, is that he knows, he remembers. This dad was reminded of that just last night. And thankfully, I've got a good wife that is there to whisper some reminders to that. He's only 6, and it's been a long weekend, and he's tired, and it's a long ride home. Now, did that mean there was not some discipline that occurred? Well, no. It means that there was something considered. Sometimes we forget what it was like to be 6 or 16. Dads and moms, or aunts and uncles on looking. But God, as our Creator who is perfect and eternal, remembers who we are. Part of what it means to model fathering after God is to remember who the kids are. And sometimes they catch us because they can be so mature and say things that are beyond their years and do things that go past that. And then the next time you turn around and they're doing something that you think is a little beneath where they should be. And that's all okay. It's all part of it. God's like that. Aren't you thankful that he doesn't somehow forget that we are mortal humans? There's something there about fatherhood. But then there is God's discipline. We flip over a few pages from the Psalms to Proverbs chapter 3, find verses 11 and 12, reminding us, and this is one of those tough pills to swallow, reminding us of the goodness of discipline. Sometimes people ask, well, if God is loving, why discipline? Why judgment? Why punishment? And there is much more to this than this sermon on fathers can share. But it is because of God's love. Because his love is pure. He loves what is good. And so this says, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline. See that? The focus is on his fatherhood, or be weary of his reproof. For, verse 12 now explains, the Lord reproves him whom he loves. As a father, the son in whom he delights. It's saying, if I didn't love you, yeah, I wouldn't care how you behave. Want to do whatever you want? Be my guest. And there's a place for allowing children to learn some lessons, but there's also a place for consequences. A compassionate father doesn't mean there isn't a place in a balance for some discipline. And there's something unique about both of these from a dad. It's different. There's overlap here. There's usually overlap in the Mother's Day sermons and the Father's Day sermons, hopefully. But you cannot replace either one. And then finally, God is one, and he carries people like a father carries a child. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 1. It's when Moses is reviewing in 30 and 31 of Deuteronomy 1. He's reviewing the children of Israel as they're preparing to finally come. And this second generation, he knows people are forgetful, and this is the new generation. And he says, this is how God treated you as a people. When he brought you out of Egypt, it was like he was carrying you like a father carries a child. It isn't just the mothers who are meant to nurture and care, hold child. And that child might be 5 months old, 5 years old, maybe even a little older. And it might go from a curdled arm to shoulders to a big hug when you just don't want to let go. God is Father. It's one of the reasons God thinks very highly about dads. Then dads have a special strength, and God values them because of that. I think of these two terms, presence and legacy. Present, meaning a father whose strength is present, who's there. Doesn't mean he doesn't have a job and he doesn't have things to do. Doesn't mean he's always at every single thing but he's there. A dad who isn't there, a dad who isn't seen. I mean, we could start quoting another older country song, right? The Man I Never Knew. That strength is missing. The presence is looking to the next term, legacy. Presence is the dad who's there to teach the sons, this is how you treat a woman. Both by words, but more by example. This is how you stand up and greet someone. This is how you shake a man's hand and look him in the eye. It's been said that moms turn boys into young men, or rather, I can't quote this morning. Okay, it's been said, let's back up. It's been said that moms turn babies, that was the word I was looking for, into boys. But it's the dads who turn boys into men. It's presence. Presence looks to legacy, and legacy is the big picture. Legacy is what the children take with them when they do finally leave the home. Legacy is what stays with them when dad not only is in a different zip code, but when dad is in the cemetery. What are we going to leave them? That's the legacy question. Presence is, what am I doing today for the legacy? Legacy then is built by presence now. And part of it is just being there. Part of it is taking the time to provide a refuge. That's what Proverbs 14:26 calls it. That a good father who is following God, who is listening to God's word, that kind of father points his children to Jesus. That kind of father, it's like he's building a refuge for his children. A place where they can come and seek help. And if you notice that, children have to be taught to ask for help. They don't tend to come by that naturally. They tend to just keep trying. They keep trying. And they might get frustrated, and they might get upset and start throwing a fit, and then that's when the parent steps in. We've got to teach them. Stop and ask. Go and find a place where a daughter can go and there's a dad to give advice, to share wisdom, to do so with a special kindness. And I could quote the statistics. We could go through multiple studies that have been done and reviewed. And the bad thing is, it tends to be, we have to look at the lack of a dad. Either he's not there at all, or he's not a good father. And then we see the effects on society. And the percentages are crazy. Or we could just say, a dad is the strength of presence and legacy in the home. Proverbs chapter 23 is a reminder of the strength that brings a smile. Let's read that one together. Proverbs 23. Proverbs 23, verse 24 and 25. There's a lot of father-child interaction in this context. He says this in verse 24, the father of the righteous will greatly rejoice. And we know this morning this is speaking in a general ideal situation. There are great fathers whose children grow up and they're not faithful to God. There are horrible fathers who end up with children turn out to be faithful and follow God. But in the overall, part of the joy of fatherhood is the smile that comes to your face when you see this. The rest of the verse says, he who fathers a wise son will be glad in him. And notice this goes to both. It's like, be the kind of father who will have these kind of children. Be the kind of children who brings a smile, not a frown. Let your father, verse 25, and mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice. I'm thankful for the dads in this room, for the dads in our world who stand as the first and final defense against the onslaughts of a culture that either says you're not needed or, yeah, you're kind of needed, but not really. And anybody can be a dad. I'm thankful for dads who show their daughters this is what a good man is like. By how he treats them, but also more importantly, how he treats their mother. This is how you protect. And it can be little things like you, as a dad, as a husband, he's the one who walks on the roadside of the sidewalk. He's the one, primary role as protector. Yeah, there's some moms who are there, thankfully, and most moms have that mama bear that comes out. But the primary responsibility, the example for this would be when there's a bump in the night. Who's the one who gets up? But there's more. The strength to teach, the strength to tell the story. Some of you saw where I posted this to my story yesterday that I'm aiming for heaven with my children, not Harvard. If they end up at Harvard, great. But if they end up digging ditches, and I see them with God one day forever. In Exodus 12, as the Israelites began their first time to observe this Passover feast, it's about God's deliverance. It's about forgiveness, freedom. And God says through Moses, there will come a time when your sons, your children, they're going to ask, what are we doing? Your kids ever asked you, why do we go to church? What's this thing up here that happens? It's the little cracker deal and the grape juice about. They ask a lot of questions, don't they? Like, why can't I leave my monster truck charging when we're away from the house? How could that start a fire? And a certain dad was tempted this morning trying to get to Bible class on time to say, he started to say, don't worry about it right now. And there's a place for times when you can't stop and explain something and ask me later. But if you don't answer when they're 6, why do you think they'll come to you and ask when they're 16? The strength of a dad says, this is our story. God's story, the story of a Savior. Strength of a dad. I took this and adapted it somewhat from a book on families. You don't love me, says the child. I have to confess, as the preacher this morning, I said that to my mother, but I didn't use the word love. There was a moment at a Kmart in Huntsville, Alabama, when I said those words, you hate me. And then I just might have also said, and I hate you. Not saying I said that, but I might have, okay? But here's how, let's keep reading this poem. How many times have your children laid that on you? And how many times have, as parents, we resisted the urge to tell them how much? Someday, when my children are old enough to understand the logic that motivates a father, I'll tell them, I loved you enough to bug you about where you were going, with whom and what time you would get home. I loved you enough to be silent and let you discover that your hand-picked friend wasn't such a friend. I loved you enough to make you return a Milky Way with a bite out of it to the drugstore and confess, I stole this. I loved you enough to stand over you for 2 hours while you cleaned your room, task that would have taken me 15 minutes. I loved you enough to not make excuses for your bad behavior. I loved you enough to ignore what every other dad did. And I loved you enough to let you stumble, fall, and fail so that you could learn to stand. I loved you enough to accept you for who you are, not for what I thought you would be. But most of all, I loved you enough to say no when you hated me for it. That was the hardest of all. The strength of a dad. I'm biased, but I really like the 1940s It's a Wonderful Life. I heard just last week about a preacher who mentioned some of that in a sermon, and he got in trouble later for spoiler alerts. And he's like, it came out in 1947. I think we're past the spoiler issue. So if I'm spoiling anything this morning, hey, it came out a few years back. You're late to the party. But I think about that moment when George Bailey bails off the bridge. His life has fallen apart. And the grumpy, irritated dad then learns what life in just that small town would be like if he never existed. And you can look at that in both ways, but I prefer this morning the positive. What kind of impact, what kind of legacy are we as people, but for this today, what kind of legacy, and I'm asking myself as much as any other dad, am I leaving in my family, in my community? God values fathers because of the irreplaceable strength of a dad. So last, I don't think least, listen. This is the part the dads like. Proverbs chapter 4. This is just one of a whole list of examples of this throughout the book of Proverbs, where there's a call to my son, listen. Listen to the wisdom of a father, and your path will be very different. Don't, and it'll be a different path, and not a lovely one. Both are challenging. To listen or not listen is going to be difficult. It's as they say in the fitness world, you choose your heart. You choose. And there may be a place for somewhat of a shift from a direct listening and obedience to honoring. The first one honors, but you could go all the way back to one of the 10 words in Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor father and mother. And this might be more as you are out on your own and you're not under that household anymore. And that's when you start thinking, yeah, I don't have to do what dad says anymore. He's not paying my insurance anymore. And there's a difference. And there should be. And this one isn't always easy. I've been there. I know the struggle. What if you don't have this kind of dad? What if you have a dad that really you learned more about hypocrisy than sincerity? How do you honor? And I don't have the answers, other than to say that sometimes you honor the role, and it might be all you can bring yourself to do. But I could lose count the dads I know who make it easy in the long run. Yeah, there may be moments when their kids hate their guts. That's why they're a good dad. To say today, this is Father's Day. What a father I have. God values fathers. Why? Because He is one Himself. He's our Father. God values fathers because fathers bring a special strength. In a society that says masculinity is the problem, God says masculinity is the problem when it's not there. Strength to be compassionate. Strength to stand up against wrong. So, if you've got a good dad, you had a good dad, today is the day, not the only day hopefully, but it can be a day, the day in that way, to celebrate. Maybe that's not the case, and so maybe today is difficult, or today is neutral, or today is when you're jealous of other people who had great dads. And sometimes that drives people to struggle with their Father in heaven. But it can also allow an opportunity for a Father in heaven and fathers, that goes far beyond genetics in this world. The joy of fatherhood. Gary's going to lead us in a song to encourage us as Christians, as dads and moms, as kiddos, and those somewhere in between. Not just to be better, but to come and enjoy the fruits of God's Word, God's family, of life with God. Let's stand and sing together.